"I'm not here to beg," Clara said, rain dripping from her coat onto Thomas Walker's porch floor. "I'm here because I can work harder than any man you've hired, and I'll prove it by morning if you give me the chance." Thomas stared at her. No woman had ever spoken to him like that. Not in 12 years of running this ranch alone. He almost said no. He almost closed the door. But something in her eyes stopped him cold, not desperation. Determination. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. Let us see how far this story has traveled. The storm had been building since noon. By the time it hit the valley south of Willow Creek, it was no longer weather. It was something closer to punishment. The wind came in from the north in long, brutal sheets, stripping leaves from the cottonwood trees along the road and turning the frozen mud into something that sucked at your boots and held on like it meant to keep you. Clara Bennett felt every step of it. She had been walking for 40 minutes from the edge of town, following directions scrawled on a torn piece of paper that was now nearly illegible from the rain. She had no lantern. The moon was buried under clouds. The only light she had came from occasional flashes of distant lightning that lit the valley for 1 second, and then dropped everything back into blackness. Her suitcase weighed more than she remembered packing. Her coat had been dry when she left Missouri. It was not dry anymore. She did not stop walking. That was the thing about Clara Bennett that most people never understood until they spent real time around her. She did not stop. Not when she was cold. Not when she was frightened. Not when every practical instinct told her she was making a mistake. She had made a decision, and she followed it to its end, even when the end was invisible in the dark. The decision that brought her here had started 3 weeks ago. She had been sitting at the edge of a boarding house bed in Willow Creek, doing the arithmetic in her head for the 4th time that day, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. She had $4.60. Rent was due in 11 days. The laundry work she had been doing for Mrs. Alderman had ended when Mrs. Alderman's daughter arrived from the east and took over the household. The position at the general store had gone to the owner's nephew. The school had already filled its teaching aide position with a girl whose father sat on the town council. She was not panicking. She was calculating. There was a difference. Panic was emotion without direction. Clara could not afford emotion without direction. She was 24 years old, alone in a territory she had arrived in 3 months ago, with nothing but skills and stubbornness alone did not pay rent. It was Mrs. Holt at the boarding house who first mentioned Thomas Walker. "He's a decent man," she said in the cautious way people said things when they weren't sure decency alone was enough to recommend someone. "Lost his wife some years back. Lives out on that big ranch past the Cedar Ridge. Word is, he's been managing the house himself since then. Not well, mind you, but he's been managing." Clara asked the obvious question. "Does he need help?" Mrs. Holt thought about it for a moment. "I don't think he'd ask for it," she said, "but that's different from not needing it." Clara wrote the name down. Thomas Walker, Walker Ranch, past the Cedar Ridge South Fork of the Valley Road. She did not rush out immediately. She thought about it for 2 days. She asked around quietly, carefully, the way she had learned to ask things in a new town, where she had no standing and no reputation to protect her mistakes. She talked to the man at the feed store who sold Walker supplies. She talked to the woman whose son sometimes hired out to help with Walker's spring roundup. What she heard was consistent, if not especially reassuring. Thomas Walker was fair. He paid what he promised. He didn't drink to excess. He kept to himself in a way that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but wasn't exactly warm either. He had been alone for 6 years. He ran his operation well enough, but it was showing signs of strain, not the kind you could see from the road, but the kind that showed up in small ways. Supplies ordered wrong. Records kept poorly. The house left to go dark before winter properly settled. How was a man who knew cattle and land, but had forgotten how to manage anything that required sustained human attention? Which was, Clara recognized exactly where she was useful. She had grown up running her father's farm records from the age of 15. She had kept the household running through 2 bad harvests and 1 summer of illness that took half her father's strength before it took him entirely. She could cook clean, organize account, negotiate with suppliers, and identify the exact moment a situation was about to go wrong 3 days before it actually did. She was not romantic about her skills. She was practical about them. She wrote Thomas Walker a letter. He did not respond. She wrote a second one. He did not respond to that either. So on the 4th night of December, when the storm came rolling in from the north, and Clara's money situation moved from concerning to genuinely alarming, she made the decision that people who knew her would later say was either the bravest thing she ever did or the most reckless. She picked up her suitcase and walked to Walker Ranch in the dark. The light she finally spotted was a single rectangle of yellow in the distance, no bigger than a candle flame from where she stood. But it was there. It was real. She crossed the last stretch of open ground and climbed the 3 steps to the porch and stood for a moment in the relative shelter of the overhang. Her breath coming out in visible clouds, her hands shaking from cold she had been ignoring for the last half hour. She did not let herself think about what she would do if he turned her away. She knocked. The sound from inside the house was someone setting something down on a hard surface, a mug maybe, or a plate. Footsteps. Not hurried. A man who moved at his own pace, regardless of what was happening outside his door. The door opened. Thomas Walker was not what she had expected. She had expected a man who looked beaten down by years of solitude. A man wearing his grief on the outside. The way grief sometimes settled into a person's posture and made them look smaller than they actually were. Thomas Walker did not look small. He was lean in the way that came from actual physical work rather than neglect. His face was weathered, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like several days, and his dark eyes had the particular quality of a man who spent a great deal of time looking at distances rather than at things close to him. He looked at her now with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like the careful assessment of a person who had learned that unexpected things showing up at your door were often problems. "I heard you needed help," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That was a skill she had spent years developing. Thomas said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her the way she was looking at him, reading, measuring filing information without comment. "You came all the way here tonight," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I sent 2 letters," Clara said. "You didn't answer them." He blinked. Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I need a job," Clara said. "Not pity. I want you to understand that before we go any further. I'm not standing here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm standing here because I have skills that would be useful to you, and you are the only person in this valley who has an open position that matches those skills. This is a practical conversation. I'd like to have it inside if that's acceptable, because I've been walking in the rain for 40 minutes, and I'm not going to pretend that's comfortable." Thomas stared at her. And then, for the first time in what felt to those who knew him like a very long time, he did something nobody expected. He almost smiled. "Come inside before you freeze," he said, and stepped back from the door. The inside of Walker Ranch's main house was exactly what Clara had suspected from everything she'd heard. It was a large space that had once been kept well and was now kept adequately. The furniture was good, solid, expensive in the quiet way of things built to last rather than to impress. The floor was clean. The dishes were washed. The fire in the iron stove was properly maintained. But there was a quality to the room that Clara recognized immediately because she had grown up in a house that eventually acquired it. The quality of a space tended by someone who kept things functional because function was necessary, not because they cared what the space felt like. A house maintained by obligation instead of love looked a particular way. Clara had lived in one. She knew. Thomas gestured to the chair nearest the stove. "Sit." "I'm not a dog," Clara said pleasantly, and sat. He stood across the room with his arms folded and watched her the way she suspected he watched most things he wasn't sure about yet. "You sent 2 letters," he said. "I did. I don't read letters that come from people I don't know." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, and decided to move past that. "Then we both wasted 3 weeks," she said. "I'd rather not waste any more time tonight if you're willing. My name is Clara Bennett. I'm from Missouri. I arrived in Willow Creek in September, looking for stable work, and I have been doing laundry and odd jobs for people, while I tried to find something suited to my actual abilities. Those abilities are as follows. She counted on her fingers. I can manage a household. I can cook 3 proper meals a day and preserve for winter. I can keep accounting records, and I am unlikely to make the kind of errors your current records contain, based on what the feed store man mentioned when I asked him about your supply orders last spring. I can read and write clearly. I can organize. I can spot problems before they become crises. Thomas unfolded his arms. What did the feed store man tell you about my supply orders? That you ordered 60 pounds of grain mix in March when you needed 40 and 40 in June when you needed 60, which suggests whoever is managing your inventory records is doing it from memory rather than from documentation. She paused. I'm guessing that's you. He was quiet for a moment. You've done your research, he said. I have a habit of understanding the situation before I walk into it. Except, he said, for the part where you walked here in a December storm at night without any guarantee I'd open the door. Clara met his eyes. I calculated the risk, she said. You're described by everyone who knows you as a decent man who keeps his word. The worst outcome was you telling me no. I've survived worse outcomes. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. What are you asking for exactly? 3 months, Clara said. Give me a trial of 3 months. I will manage the house, organize the records, prepare meals, and help with whatever administrative work needs doing. At the end of 3 months, if you're satisfied, we discuss terms for continuing. If you're not satisfied, I leave without argument. In exchange, I want fair wages. I'll tell you what I consider fair, and you can tell me if you disagree, and a private room and meals. That's a business proposal, Thomas said. Yes, Clara said. That's what it is. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. Most women who come out here looking for a position, he said slowly, aren't quite this direct about it. Most women who come out here looking for a position, Clara said, probably have more options than I currently do. I don't have the luxury of being indirect. He pulled a chair from the table and sat down across from her. It was the first time he had sat in his own kitchen with another person in 6 years. Neither of them knew that yet. Tell me what you consider fair wages, he said. They talked for 2 hours. Not the careful circling kind of conversation that happens between strangers who are afraid of saying the wrong thing. The direct, efficient kind that happens between 2 people who are both tired and both practical and both aware that time is not something to squander. Thomas asked about her background. She told him straight facts, no drama. Father dead, farm lost, months of scrabbling to stay afloat. Eventual arrival in Willow Creek, on the advice of a cousin who had exaggerated the opportunities available. He asked about her experience with ranch operations specifically. She told him honestly she knew farming, not ranching. But the organizational principles were the same, and she was a fast learner, and she was already familiar with basic supply accounting from helping her father. He told her about this ranch. Also straight facts, also no drama. 340 acres. 112 head of cattle currently. 2 hired ranch hands who worked the land, men named Pete and Gus, who had been with him for years and would not be part of her responsibilities. The house was hers to manage. The records were hers to organize. The meals were hers to plan and prepare. He did not tell her about his wife. She did not ask. By the time the storm had settled into a steady, less violent rain, and the fire had burned lower, the practical framework of an arrangement had been established. Wages that were fair. Clara had proposed a number, and he had matched it without negotiation, which told her something about him. A room in the east wing of the house, small but private. Meals provided. 3 months to prove her value. One more thing, Thomas said, as Clara was folding away the small notepad she had pulled from her coat to write down the terms. She looked up. This ranch is not a social situation, he said. It came out carefully, like he'd thought about how to phrase it. I don't need a housekeeper to also be company. I don't need conversation at meals. I don't need anything beyond the practical arrangement we've just described. Clara looked at him for a moment. I understand, she said. I just want that to be clear from the beginning. It's clear, she said. And then, because she believed in honesty as a policy. You should know, though, that I'm not naturally a quiet person. I'll respect whatever boundaries you establish. But if you ask me a direct question, I will give you a direct answer. And if I see something that needs to be said, I'll say it. She paused. That's not negotiable. Thomas looked at her. Fair enough, he said finally. She picked up her suitcase. He showed her to the East Wing room. It was small, as he had said, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the yard. There was a candle on the stand and a wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed. Thomas set her bag just inside the door. There's wood in the box if you're cold, he said. Breakfast is usually at 6. What do you eat for breakfast? Clara asked. He paused in the doorway. Whatever there is, he said. Clara nodded. Tomorrow morning there'll be something better, she said. Thomas looked at her for one more moment, and then he left. Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and let out the long breath she had been holding since she knocked on the door. She had done it. She had gotten the job. She did not know yet that she had also walked into the most important decision of her life. She did not know that the quiet man who had led her to this room with 4 words and 1 candle was going to matter to her in ways she would not be able to explain for a very long time. She only knew she was dry and warm, and there was work waiting in the morning. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The next morning, Thomas Walker came downstairs at 5 minutes past 6 and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The kitchen smelled different. He had not noticed yesterday how the kitchen smelled. It smelled the way his kitchen always smelled: wood smoke and iron, and the faint, stale quality of a space where someone cooked out of necessity and not out of any particular care. This morning, it smelled like bread. Real bread, the kind with some heat still in it, the kind that filled a cold room the way nothing else did. Clara was standing at the stove with her back to him, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had spent years in a kitchen. She had tied her hair back. She was wearing a plain working dress, dark blue, worn, but clean, and she moved from the stove to the table and back without hesitation, like she had already mapped the space and knew exactly where everything was. On the table, bread, still warm. A pot of coffee, actually strong. Scrambled eggs with something added. He wasn't sure what herbs, of some kind, from where she had found herbs in his kitchen, he didn't know. A small bowl of preserves. He stood in the doorway for a moment too long. Clara glanced over her shoulder. Sit down, she said. Coffee's hot. Thomas sat. He could not have explained why he didn't argue with the instruction. He was a man who ran his own ranch, gave his own orders, answered to no one. He had not been told to sit at his own table in 6 years. He sat. He ate. The eggs were better than anything he had made in the past year. He was not going to say that out loud, but it was true. Clara sat across from him with her own plate and a cup of coffee, and a small notepad beside her, which she glanced at occasionally. Your supply inventory, she said after a few minutes of silence. Do you keep records in the barn or in the house? The house, Thomas said. There's a box in the front room. I looked at it this morning, she said. He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. You were up before me, he said. I was up at 4:30, she said without particular emphasis. The bread needed time. She looked down at her notepad. Your records go back about 2 years consistently. Before that, it becomes difficult to follow. I'd like to start there. Understand the current baseline, and then work back to identify any patterns that are causing the supply ordering problems. Thomas set down his cup. You worked out that I have supply ordering problems from one conversation with the man at the feed store, he said. I worked out a symptom, Clara said. I don't know the cause yet. That's what I'm trying to understand. Most people who've worked here, Thomas said slowly, didn't ask questions like this. What kind of people have worked here? Ranch hands, he said. Cattlemen. People who knew their job and did it. I know my job too, Clara said. My job is to manage this house and these records. I can't do that well without understanding what's in them. She looked at him. Is that a problem? He thought about it for a moment. No, he said. Good, Clara said, and looked back at her notepad. They ate in silence for a while. It was not the uncomfortable silence of two strangers who had run out of things to say. It was a different kind, the silence of two people who had enough words and were choosing to save them for things that required them. Thomas Walker had not shared a morning meal with another person in 6 years. He did not think about that while it was happening. He thought about it later in the barn while he was checking the condition of his horses, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch moved around him. I thought that was not as difficult as I expected. He didn't know what to do with that. 2 weeks passed. Not quietly, that was the thing he noticed. Clara did not make his house quiet. She made it active. She moved through it with purpose, and she organized it, and cleaned it, and transformed it in ways that were practical first and aesthetically secondary, and somehow both at once. The records she found in the front room box took her 4 days to reorganize. She spread them across the dining table in a system that made no sense to Thomas when she explained it, and then perfect sense when she showed him the results. "Here," she said, pointing to a column she had created. "This is what you spent on grain in the last 18 months, versus what the cattle required based on their numbers and the season. See this gap?" He leaned over the table beside her. The gap was significant. "Where did the money go?" he asked. "That's the interesting question," Clara said. "I don't think it went anywhere dishonest. I think it went to the wrong places at the wrong times because nobody was watching the whole picture at once." She tapped the column. "You ordered for what you needed now, not for what you'd need in 2 months, which means you paid premium prices in lean seasons and had surplus in the wrong seasons." Thomas stared at the numbers. "That's been costing me," he said. "Steadily," Clara confirmed. "It's not a crisis, but it adds up." He straightened and looked at her. She was looking at the numbers with the focused expression he had learned to recognize. She wore it whenever she was working out a problem. Slightly narrowed eyes, one finger moving along a column. She was not looking at him. She was not performing the explanation for his benefit. She was simply explaining what she saw. It was the most honest thing he had experienced in a room with another person in longer than he could precisely remember. "What's your recommendation?" he asked. She looked up. "Let me build you a 6-month projection," she said. "Based on the cattle numbers and the seasonal patterns, I can give you a purchase calendar that reduces the emergency orders. It'll take me a few days to put together properly, but once it exists, you keep it updated, and the problem solves itself." "You can do that," he said. It was not a question. He had watched her for 2 weeks. He knew by now that when Clara Bennett said she could do something, she had already worked out whether it was true. "I can do that," she said. Thomas nodded and walked back to the barn. He stood in the hay-scented quiet for a long moment and thought about the fact that the box of records that had been sitting in his front room for 2 years, accumulating, going unread, representing a problem he'd known existed and had not known how to approach, had been decoded and organized in 4 days by a woman who had arrived on his porch in a December rainstorm. He thought about his wife Margaret, who had kept every record meticulously, who had known at any given moment exactly what was in the house and what was needed and where everything was. He thought about the 6 years since she had died. He thought about how much of his life since then had been the experience of knowing things were not right and not knowing how to make them right, and just enduring that as a fact of existence. He pushed the thought away, as he always pushed thoughts like that away. He went back to work. The first real moment between them happened at the end of the 2nd week. Thomas found Clara in the main room at 8 in the evening, sitting in the candlelight, repairing a pair of curtains that had been hanging in disrepair since sometime the previous winter. She had needles and thread on the table beside her, and she was working in the patient, methodical way she did everything. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "Those curtains," he said. She looked up. "What about them?" He tried to find the right words for what he had been about to say, which was something like, "Those have been like that since before you arrived, and they're just curtains, and you don't have to bother." But the way she was sitting there with the candlelight on her face, doing something that she hadn't been asked to do, something purely for the benefit of the house, stopped him. "Why are you doing that?" he said instead. "They still work," Clara replied simply. "The fabric's good, they just need mending." Thomas leaned against the doorframe. "They're just curtains," he said. Clara looked at him. She was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from her usual silences. "I grew up hearing that," she said. "About things that were damaged. People would say it's just an old coat, just a worn-out tool, just a fence post that can't hold anymore. And sometimes they said it about people too." She looked back at the curtain in her hands. "That something broken doesn't have value. That something worn down isn't worth the effort of repairing." She moved the needle through the fabric with careful precision. "I don't agree with that. I think sometimes the things that have lasted through damage are more valuable than the things that never got tested." Thomas was quiet. The fire in the stove made small sounds. The wind outside moved against the window glass. "Your father," he said after a moment. Clara didn't look up. "He tried," she said. "He worked until he couldn't. And when he was gone, people looked at what he'd left behind. The debts, the worn-out equipment, the land that needed more than he'd been able to give it, and they saw something failed, something not worth the trouble." Her voice was even steady the way it always was. "They were wrong. He built something real. It just needed someone to keep building." Thomas did not say anything. He was not sure he trusted himself to say the right thing. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he walked to the fire and added another log, and the room became warmer. He did not go back to his room. He sat in the chair on the other side of the room and picked up the record book he'd been meaning to look at and opened it. They did not talk. But they sat in the same room for 2 hours, both of them working, and neither of them moved to leave. Thomas Walker, who had not voluntarily spent an evening in the company of another person for 6 years, did not think about that while it was happening. He only thought about it later in the dark of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Something about this, he thought, is going to be complicated. He didn't know yet how right he was. The thing that nobody told you about loneliness, the real long-term kind, the kind that settled into a person over years rather than weeks, was that it changed your expectations without your permission. Thomas Walker had not decided to stop expecting warmth. He had not made a conscious choice to live at arm's length from everything that wasn't cattle or land. It had happened gradually, incrementally, the way a river changes course. One day, it had simply been true, the way many things were simply true, now that had once required decisions. He had been a different man when Margaret was alive. Not happier exactly. He believed happiness was too simple a word for what a good marriage actually was. More present, maybe. More attentive to the texture of daily life, to the small details that made the difference between a house and a home. Margaret had a quality of noticing things she noticed when he was tired before he acknowledged it. Noticed when the light was particularly beautiful, falling across the valley. Noticed the things that needed tending before they became problems. He had not realized until she was gone how much of his attention had been sustained by her attention in the 6 years since he had managed. People said that about him. Thomas manages well, considering, and they meant it as a compliment, and he understood that, and he tried to take it as one. But managing was not living. He knew that. He had stopped looking at the difference. By the end of the first month, Clara had reorganized his record-keeping system, entirely built the 6-month supply projection she had promised, renegotiated the terms of his account at the general store to reflect his actual purchasing patterns, identified 3 maintenance issues on the property that needed addressing before winter, deepened and cooked 30 mornings of breakfast that were without exception better than anything he had eaten in 6 years. She had also, without particularly intending to become someone he thought about when she wasn't in the room. Not romantically. Or at least, that was what he told himself. It was simpler than that. It was the thing that happened when you were accustomed to silence, and someone arrived who filled the silence with purpose rather than noise. You noticed her presence the way you noticed the sun after a long gray spell. Not as something romantic, just as something real. Pete, one of his hired hands, said something about it the 3rd week. "That woman knows what she's doing," Pete said, in the careful way of a man who had worked for Thomas long enough to know when to be careful. "She does," Thomas said. "Making a difference around here," Pete said. Thomas said nothing. Pete, who had worked for Thomas for 9 years and had learned a great deal about when to press and when to let things rest. The night she told him about her father, the full version, not the compressed practical summary she had given him. The first night they had been sitting at the kitchen table after supper, not by design, but by the kind of gradual accident that happens when two people have stopped actively avoiding each other. Clara had been going over the updated record books. Thomas had been reading a survey report about his eastern grazing land. The lamp was between them. "How is a stubborn man?" Clara said, not looking up from the records. Everybody who knew him said so. He would have agreed. Thomas lowered his survey report slightly. "Your father," he said. "My father," she confirmed. "He had 2 bad harvests in a row, and he should have sold some of the land when the price was good, and he refused to. He believed the land was the thing you didn't let go of, even when letting go would have saved everything else." She turned a page. "He was wrong about that in practical terms, but I understand why he thought it." Thomas set the survey down. "What happened to the land?" "The bank got most of it," Clara said. "After he died, there was no one to service the debt. I tried. I did everything I knew how to do. But I was 22 and a woman, and nobody with legal authority to lend money wanted to hear what I thought I could manage." She was quiet for a moment. "They weren't wrong exactly. I probably couldn't have saved it, but I would have tried harder than any of the men who eventually made decisions about what happened to it." Thomas looked at her. She was still looking at the records. Her voice had the same even, controlled quality it always had. But he was beginning to understand that evenness was not the same as absence of feeling. It was the opposite. It was the sound of someone who felt things deeply and had developed a rigorous discipline about when and how to show it. "What did you do?" he asked. "After." "I did what a person does," Clara said. "I went looking for the next thing." She finally looked up. "That's how I got here." Thomas held her gaze. "You don't seem defeated by it," he said. "I'm not," Clara said. "I'm sad about it. That's different." She looked at him steadily. "My father taught me something valuable, even if he didn't mean to. He taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do is confuse what you've lost with what you are. He lost the farm. He started to believe that meant he'd lost himself." She paused. "He hadn't, but he started to act like he had. And that was the thing that actually defeated him." The lamp made small sounds between them. Thomas thought about a man alone on a ranch for 6 years, burying himself in cattle and maintenance and the steady avoidance of anything that required feeling. He thought about the difference between managing and living. He thought about the fact that this woman sitting across from him with a lamp and a record book had walked across a valley in a December storm because she refused to let what she'd lost define what she was. He thought, "I have not been doing that. I thought I have been doing exactly the opposite of that for 6 years." He did not say any of this. He picked up the survey report, but he did not read it. He sat with it in his hands and thought about what it meant to be alive in a house that you had stopped living in, and about a woman who had arrived carrying 1 suitcase and already in 30 days made the house feel like something he hadn't let it be in years. Outside the window, the winter dark lay over the valley. Inside, the lamp burned steadily between them. Thomas Walker sat in his own kitchen and felt for the first time in a very long time the particular weight of a life that still had room in it for something more. He didn't know what to do with that. But he didn't push it away. And that, for Thomas Walker, was new. The supply projection Clara had promised took her 4 days to build and changed the way Thomas ran his ranch in ways he hadn't expected and would not easily admit. He admitted it anyway. He was not a man who argued with evidence when the evidence was sitting in front of him in a neatly organized column with the numbers clearly marked. "This saves me how much?" he asked on the morning she showed him the completed document. "Over 6 months, approximately $40 in premium pricing alone," Clara said. "Plus whatever you save by not having to make emergency orders when the planned supply runs short, which based on the last 2 winters was at least 3 times per season." Thomas looked at the numbers. "Nobody told me it was this bad," he said. "Nobody was watching it," Clara said. "That's different from it not being happening." He looked up at her. She was standing on the other side of the table, with her hands folded in front of her, in the businesslike way she had when she was presenting information. she was confident about which was most of the time. "I'll get this to the store by Friday," he said. "I already sent a letter," Clara said. He stopped. "You sent a letter?" "To confirm the terms I renegotiated with Mr. Greer last week. I assumed you'd want it in writing before the new ordering cycle." She held his gaze with the steady directness he had come to recognize as her default mode. "If I overstepped, tell me, and I'll ask before I act next time." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Did Greer agree to the terms?" "He agreed to all of them," Clara said. "He also said, and I'm quoting directly, that it was about time someone at Walker Ranch read the fine print." Thomas exhaled slowly. "He's not wrong," he said. "No," Clara said. "He isn't." She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, and Thomas stood at the table looking at the supply projection that would save his operation $40 in 6 months, and thought about the fact that the woman who had built it had been on his ranch for 34 days and had already done more for his operational efficiency than he had managed in 2 years of trying. He thought about the fact that he was not surprised by this. He thought that was probably significant. Pete noticed first. Pete noticed everything eventually. 9 years of working for a man who communicated mostly in single syllables and meaningful silences had given Pete an advanced degree in reading the atmosphere of Walker Ranch, and the atmosphere of Walker Ranch had changed. He said something to Gus about it one morning in the barn. "She's good," Pete said in the simple declarative way he said things he was confident about. Gus, who had been with Thomas for 7 years and was slightly less diplomatic than Pete, said, "She's more than good. The man smiled yesterday." Pete looked at him. Thomas Walker smiled. "I saw it," Gus said. "She said something about the grain inventory, something about the numbers being off by a decimal point she'd caught, and she made some comment about how lucky it was she caught it before he'd ordered enough grain to feed half of Colorado. And he—" Gus paused. He smiled. Not a big smile, but a real one. Pete thought about this. "Don't say anything to him," Pete said finally. "I know better than that," Gus said. They went back to work. But Pete carried the information with him for the rest of the day, turning it over in his mind, the way he turned over everything that mattered at Walker Ranch, which was to say carefully, quietly, and with the full understanding that what happened in the main house was not his business, but was absolutely his concern, because a man who had been running himself into the ground for 6 years, out of something that looked from the outside very much like grief, was a man worth paying attention to. So, the first time Clara laughed in the house, Thomas stopped walking in the hallway. He was on his way from his room to the kitchen early morning, the house still dark except for the kitchen light, and the sound came from behind the kitchen door. Brief, unguarded, the real kind of laugh that wasn't performing anything. He pushed the door open. Clara was standing at the stove. She had knocked the flour tin off the shelf with her elbow, and a significant quantity of flour had gone across the front of her apron, and also evidently her face, because there was flour on her nose and left cheekbone, and she was laughing at herself in the honest way of someone who had been startled and found it funny rather than infuriating. She turned when the door opened and saw him and said, "Don't." "I didn't say anything," Thomas said. "You were about to." "I wasn't." He crossed to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup and turned to lean against the counter. The flour was still on her face. He said nothing. She turned back to the stove. "There's a crack in the shelf bracket," she said in the brisk professional voice she used when she wanted to move past something. "It's been pulling out of the wall gradually. I'll get Gus to look at it today." "I can fix it," Thomas said. She glanced over her shoulder. "You'll fix it today." The skepticism in her voice was mild but precise. He looked at her. "I'll fix it today," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. He fixed it that afternoon. When she saw it that evening, she ran her hand along the bracket and tested it and said nothing. But she nodded once, the small nod she gave when something met her standards, and Thomas found himself unreasonably satisfied by that. I thought about that later and recognized it as the beginning of something he wasn't ready to name. The trouble with letting yourself feel comfortable again. Thomas had learned this once the hard way, and had apparently not learned it thoroughly enough, was that comfortable things could be taken away. He remembered this 3 weeks later when he came inside at noon to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in her hands and an expression on her face he hadn't seen before. She wasn't crying. Clara Bennett, he had observed, did not cry in front of other people. But she looked the way a person looked when something had landed hard and they were still in the process of deciding what to do about it. He set down his coat. "What is it?" She looked up. She handed him the paper without speaking. It was a letter. The handwriting was sharp, confident, the kind of handwriting used by people who believed they had authority. The letterhead at the top read, "Caldwell Land and Property Holdings Registered Territory Business, Harlan County." He read it quickly. The language was careful in the way that legal language was careful. It said nothing directly offensive and implied everything damaging. It referenced certain matters of public interest regarding the financial stability of Walker Ranch. It referenced certain matters of concern about the propriety of the current domestic arrangement. It expressed in the roundabout language of a man who knew lawyers a strong interest in discussing the purchase of Walker property at a fair market price before any unpleasant complications arose. It was signed by Richard Caldwell. Thomas set the letter down. "When did this come?" "This morning." "Morning," Clara said, "while you were in the North Field." She folded her hands on the table with deliberate calm. "Thomas, who is Richard Caldwell?" Thomas pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The name Richard Caldwell had been in the back of his mind for 2 years, like a stone you kept stepping around on a familiar path. You knew it was there, you avoided it. You told yourself you'd deal with it eventually. "He's a businessman," Thomas said, "out of Harlan County. He's been buying up land in this valley for 3 years, small operations mostly, people who've had a bad season or two and can't recover." "Buying," Clara said, "or forcing?" Thomas looked at her. "I've heard things," he said. "I can't prove them." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What kind of things?" Thomas said. "The Merritt family sold their land to Caldwell 18 months ago. People said they sold voluntarily. But Ed Merritt told me privately that there had been problems with their water supply that nobody could explain. A fence that kept getting cut. Contracts with buyers that somehow fell through at the last moment." He picked up the letter and looked at it again. None of it could be proven, but the pattern was consistent. Clara took the letter back. She read it again slowly, the way she read things when she was extracting every layer of meaning. "He mentions the domestic arrangement," she said. "Yes. He's suggesting that my being here is a liability for you. That's what he's suggesting." Clara set the letter down precisely in the center of the table. "He's wrong about the facts," she said. "There is nothing improper about this arrangement." "No," Thomas said. "There isn't." "But he's going to say there is. He's going to say whatever is useful," Thomas said. "That's how he operates." Silence. Clara looked at the letter. Thomas looked at Clara. "Are you worried?" he asked. She considered the question with the honesty she brought to everything. "I'm angry," she said. "I spent a month building something real here, something that helps this ranch operate better. And some man who has never been in this house is going to use my presence here to imply something that isn't true, to serve an agenda that has nothing to do with me." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable thing to be angry about." "What are you going to do about the letter?" "Nothing yet," Thomas said. "Responding to Caldwell before I understand what he actually has in hand would be a mistake. He's fishing. He sends letters like this to see what reaction he gets." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to react." Clara met his eyes. "And the property," she said. "Is not for sale," Thomas said. There was no particular heat in it, just the flat certainty of a man who had made a decision so long ago that he had stopped thinking of it as a decision. Something in Clara's face shifted. She picked up the letter, folded it precisely, and set it aside. "Then we go back to work," she said. And they did. That evening after supper, Thomas found Pete outside the barn and told him about the letter in the brief, factual way he communicated serious things. Pete listened without interrupting. "Caldwell," Pete said when Thomas finished. "Caldwell," Thomas confirmed. Pete turned a piece of rope over in his hands. You know what he did to the Hensley operation, Pete said. I know. They had 3 generations on that land. I know Pete. Pete looked at him. What do you need from me? Keep your eyes open, Thomas said. Anything that seems wrong, fence lines, water equipment. Anything that shouldn't be happening. You tell me immediately. Pete nodded. And Gus? Tell Gus the same. Pete was quiet for a moment. Thomas, he said. Thomas looked at him. The woman, Pete said carefully. Miss Bennett. She knows what she's doing. She's not a problem. Thomas held Pete's gaze. I know that, he said. Just making sure you knew it, Pete said. Thomas turned and walked back toward the house, and Pete watched him go, and thought that the situation with Richard Caldwell was serious, and the situation with Thomas Walker and the woman from Missouri was also serious, and both of them were developing faster than Thomas realized. The second month settled differently than the first. The first month had been the business of establishing routines, responsibilities. The careful mapping of how 2 people with strong habits shared a space without collision. The second month was something else. It was the month when the space between careful and close began to compress. It happened in small moments that accumulated, the way small moments did, not dramatically, not with declarations, but with the slow gravitational pull of 2 people who were paying genuine attention to each other. Thomas began talking at breakfast, not extensively, not the way some men talked, filling silence with the sound of their own voice, but real sentences about real things. He told her about the eastern grazing land and the question of whether to rotate the herd earlier than usual. He told her what Pete had said about the condition of the winter pasture fencing. He told her once about a horse he'd had for 11 years that had died the previous spring, and how the barn still felt wrong without her in a way he hadn't gotten used to. Clara listened. She listened the way she did everything completely, without performing attention, without preparing her next sentence while he was still speaking. She just heard him. And she answered. Not with the careful social responses of someone managing a conversation. With her actual thoughts. You should get another horse, she said about the barn that felt wrong. I've thought about it, Thomas said. What's stopping you? He thought about it. I keep comparing, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's true of most things, she said. The first horse you love sets a standard that's impossible, but that doesn't mean the next one isn't worth having. Thomas looked at his coffee cup. You're talking about more than the horse, he said. I'm talking about the horse, Clara said. What else would I be talking about? He looked up. She was looking at her record book. There was a quality to the silence that followed that Thomas spent a great deal of time not examining. The gossip reached Clara through Mrs. Dawson, the wife of the man who supplied Thomas's winter firewood. Mrs. Dawson arrived one Thursday morning to deliver a message about a delayed firewood order and stayed in the way of women who had information they felt obligated to share long enough to make her actual purpose clear. People are talking, she said over the cup of coffee Clara had offered her. People talk, Clara said pleasantly. About you, Mrs. Dawson said. She had the careful tone of someone who believed she was performing a kindness. About you being out here, alone with Thomas. People are saying. I know what people are saying, Clara said. Mrs. Dawson stopped. I work here, Clara said. I manage the household and the records. That is the complete truth of my situation, and anyone who has said otherwise has either been misinformed or has chosen to be dishonest. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that was warm and absolute and did not invite argument. Would you like more coffee before you go? Mrs. Dawson went. Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the wagon leave and felt the familiar particular anger of a woman who had been doing everything correctly and was still being reduced to a rumor. She heard the front door and turned. Thomas was standing in the kitchen doorway. I saw the Dawson wagon, he said. Firewood delay, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. What else? She turned from the window. She heard the talk, Clara said. She came to warn me. A beat. Or possibly to confirm it. I'm not entirely sure which. Thomas's expression was unreadable in the way it got when he was working something out. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it that wasn't usually there, an edge, like a door held shut from the inside. "Don't apologize for something that isn't your fault, and don't suggest I should leave because of it. That is not what I want to hear." He stopped. He looked at her. "What do you want to hear?" he asked. The question surprised her. She could tell it surprised him too. She thought about it honestly. "I want to hear that you know the truth," she said finally, "and that the truth is what matters." Thomas said, "I know the truth." He said it the same way he said things about the property not being for sale. The flat certainty of something already decided. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. "Lunch in an hour," she said. Thomas went back to work. But something had shifted between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them was ready yet to talk about what it was. The twist came on a Tuesday, and it came in the form of a man named Harrison arriving at the ranch while Thomas was in town at the survey office. Clara answered the door. Harrison was a lawyer. He had the particular look of a man whose authority came from paperwork rather than anything physical. He was small, neatly dressed, with sharp eyes that moved around the porch, taking inventory before he spoke. "I'm here to see Thomas Walker," he said. "He's not available," Clara said. "A formal notice," Harrison said, "regarding certain financial obligations attached to the original land deed that have been in arrears for a period that now requires legal attention." Clara looked at the envelope. She had been through Thomas's records extensively. She knew his financial situation with the specificity of someone who had built a 6-month supply projection from scratch. She knew his debts. She knew his accounts. She knew the land deed. "What specific obligations?" she said. Harrison blinked. "That's a matter for Mr. Walker," he said. "Mr. Walker manages this property," Clara said, "and I manage his administrative records. If there's a financial notice regarding this ranch, I will need to understand its basis before it's presented to him. That's how this household operates." She held out her hand for the envelope. "Or you can leave the notice with me, and I will review it before he returns." Harrison looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He handed her the envelope. Clara took it without opening it in front of him. "Thank you," she said. "I'll make sure Mr. Walker receives it." Harrison turned and left. Clara closed the door. She stood very still in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down and opened the envelope. What she read made her go quiet in a different way than her usual quiet. The notice claimed that Walker Ranch carried a debt obligation attached to a secondary deed provision from 12 years prior. An obscure clause in the original land purchase agreement that, if the notice was accurate, would allow a creditor holding that debt to claim a portion of the ranch property if the obligation was not resolved within 60 days. The creditor named in the notice was Caldwell Land and Property Holdings. Clara read the document 3 times. Then she went to the box where Thomas kept the original ranch documents. She found the deed. She found the original purchase agreement. She read them carefully, with the concentrated attention she brought to record-keeping, looking for the provision the notice described. It wasn't there. She read the documents again. It wasn't there. The provision Caldwell's lawyer had cited did not exist in Thomas's original land documentation. Clara sat back. She was very quiet for a long moment. Then she got up and found her notepad and began writing specific questions, specific document numbers, specific legal language that needed to be checked against territory filing records. She was still writing when Thomas came home 2 hours later. He found her at the table with documents spread around her and the expression on her face that he had learned to take seriously. The narrowed eyes, full focus expression that meant she had found something and was working out what it meant. "What happened?" he said immediately. She looked up. "A lawyer named Harrison was here," she said. "He brought a notice from Caldwell." She handed him the document. "Caldwell is claiming there's a debt provision in your original deed that gives him grounds to claim ranch property." Thomas took the document and read it. She watched his face change. "This provision," he said. "Doesn't exist," Clara said. "I checked your original deed and your purchase agreement. The clause they're citing isn't in either document." Thomas set the notice down. He looked at her. "You checked the original documents," he said. "I went through every page," Clara said. "Thomas, he fabricated this. Or he's claiming a provision that was added to a falsified version of your deed. Either way, this notice is based on documentation that doesn't match what you actually signed 12 years ago." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when something shifted from concerning to serious. "That means," Thomas said slowly, "that somewhere in the territory filing system, there may be a version of my deed that's different from the one I have." "That's what it means," Clara said. He looked at the notice again. 60 days, he said. 60 days, Clara confirmed. Thomas was very still for a long moment. Then something settled in his face, not calm exactly, but resolve. The look of a man who had been waiting for a fight to have an actual shape. "All right," he said. "All right," Clara said. "Caldwell wants to play this way," Thomas said. "Then we play this way." He looked at her. "What do you need to prove that the provision is fabricated?" Clara looked at her notepad. "Access to the territory filing records," she said. "The original deed as filed with the territory office 12 years ago. Any correspondence connected to the land purchase. And time." "I can get you to the territory office," Thomas said. "Tomorrow morning if you want." "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. Thomas picked up the falsified notice and looked at it one more time. He set it down with the deliberate care of a man placing something aside that he intended to pick back up. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "This isn't—" He stopped and chose his words. "This is beyond what I hired you to do." Clara met his eyes. "This ranch is under attack," she said simply. "I work here. That makes it my concern." A pause. "Unless you disagree." Thomas held her gaze for a moment. "I don't disagree," he said. Something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but real. The particular thing that happens between two people who have been carefully maintaining professional distance and find that in a moment of genuine crisis, the distance is gone without either of them having decided to remove it. Clara looked back at her notepad. Thomas walked to the stove and poured himself coffee and stood there for a moment, thinking about a woman who had arrived at his door 6 weeks ago looking for work and was now without any hesitation fighting for his land as if it were her own. He thought about what that meant. He thought about the fact that somewhere in his chest, something that had been shut for 6 years had cracked open just slightly, just enough to let in a sliver of something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. He thought she came here needing a job. He thought I need something too. He wasn't ready yet to say what it was, but he knew, and knowing even in silence was a beginning. The territory office in Harlan County was a 3-hour ride from Walker Ranch, and they left before dawn. Thomas drove. Clara sat beside him with a satchel on her lap, containing copies of every document she had pulled from the ranch records, the original deed, the purchase agreement, the payment history, and the falsified notice from Caldwell's lawyer, which she had read 4 more times the night before, and found no less infuriating with each reading. They did not talk much on the road. That was not unusual between them anymore. Their silences had changed over the weeks. They had lost the careful quality of two strangers monitoring the space between them and become something more settled. The kind of quiet that happened between people who had nothing to prove to each other. But this silence had a different texture. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, and his jaw was set in the particular way Clara had learned meant he was working something through. She did not push him. She knew from experience that pushing Thomas Walker when he was thinking produced shorter answers than waiting for him to finish thinking. Halfway to Harlan, he said, "Richard Caldwell bought the Hensley land 2 years ago." Clara looked at him. "The Hensleys had been there 30 years, Thomas said. 3 generations. Their grandfather built the original house. When they sold, and I'm using that word the way people use it when they mean something more complicated than selling, they moved to their daughter's place in Nebraska. Ed Hensley said to me before he left that he felt like he'd failed his grandfather." Clara was quiet. "He hadn't failed anyone," Thomas said. "But Caldwell found something in his deed, some provision, some document that gave him leverage nobody could explain or disprove fast enough to matter." He paused. By the time the Hensleys understood what had happened to them, it was already over. Clara looked at the satchel in her lap. "That's not going to happen here," she said. Thomas glanced at her. "No," he said. "It's not." The certainty in his voice matched hers. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now, the kind that existed between two people who had made a decision together without needing to vote on it. The territory filing office was run by a man named Aldous Crane, who had the look of someone who had spent 30 years in a room full of paper and had slowly taken on its qualities, dry, precise, yellowed at the edges. He looked at Clara when they walked in with the expression, "Men in official positions sometimes gave women who showed up in official places not hostile exactly, but with the particular blankness of a person who had not yet decided whether she was relevant." Thomas said, "We need to see the filed deed for Walker Ranch, original filing 12 years ago." Crane looked at Thomas. "That would be in the territorial records," he said. "Takes time to locate." "We'll wait," Clara said. Crane looked at her. "It could take most of the morning," he said. "We have most of the morning," Clara said pleasantly. Crane went to find the records. Thomas leaned against the counter. Clara opened her satchel and spread her documents on the counter surface and began reviewing them again, making notes on her pad in the quick shorthand she used when she was working at speed. "You've read those documents 6 times. You've read those documents 6 times, Thomas said. 7, Clara said without looking up. "I want to know exactly where the discrepancy is before we see the filed version." If Caldwell altered the filed copy, the alteration will be in a specific place. Probably the secondary deed provisions section, which is page 4 in your original. She tapped her copy. "I want to know what the language should say before I see what it says." Thomas looked at her. "So you can catch it immediately," he said. "So I can catch it immediately," she confirmed. Howe was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before," he said. "This kind of document work." Clara glanced up briefly. "My father's estate," she said. "When he died, there were 3 people who claimed debts he owed them that he didn't owe. 2 of them had documentation. The documentation was wrong. I proved it." She looked back at her notepad. "The 3rd one was honest, which I also proved, and I paid him from the land sale." A beat. "The experience taught me that paperwork is not automatically truthful just because it's official." Thomas absorbed this. "What happened to the 2 who were dishonest?" "One of them left town before anything formal could be done," Clara said. "The other one had a longer history of the same behavior and eventually answered for it." She looked up. "That's what I'm counting on with Caldwell. Men who do this once have done it before, which means there's a pattern, and patterns leave records." Thomas looked at her with the expression he sometimes got, the one she'd noticed more frequently in the past 2 weeks. The one she didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt like a conversation she wasn't ready to have. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Simple, direct. The way he said everything that mattered. She held his gaze for one moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Let's see what Crane brings us first." What Crane brought was worse than Clara had expected, and exactly what she had suspected. The filed copy of Thomas Walker's deed was not the same document as the copy Thomas held. The differences were small and professional. The kind of alterations made by someone who understood legal language well enough to add a provision that sounded like it belonged without disrupting the overall structure of the document. The secondary deed section on page 4 contained 3 additional sentences that did not appear in Thomas's original copy. Those sentences, carefully worded, established a conditional debt obligation that could be claimed by a third party under specific circumstances. The circumstances described matched precisely the situation Caldwell was now asserting. Clara read the altered section twice. Then she set it beside her original copy and set them both on the counter and said to Thomas, "Look at page 4, the 3rd paragraph." Thomas read it. Then he read it again. His face went very still. "That paragraph," he said carefully, "is not in my deed." "No," Clara said. "It is not." But it's in the filed copy. It is. Thomas looked at Crane. When was this document last accessed? He said. Crane blinked. The filed deed. Yes. Who has looked at it? When? I want a record of every access. Crane looked uncomfortable in the way of a man who was realizing that a routine records request had become something significantly less routine. I would need to check the access log, he said. Check it, Thomas said. Crane went back to his files. He was gone for 8 minutes. When he returned, he had a ledger with him, and his discomfort had become something closer to genuine worry. The filed deed was accessed 4 months ago, he said, by an agent representing Caldwell Land and Property Holdings. They had a letter of authorization for review purposes. Clara wrote this down. Review purposes, she said. Not amendment purposes. No, Crane said. An amendment to a filed deed would require a formal filing, a signed authorization, witnesses. And was any such filing made at that time? Clara said. Crane looked at his ledger. He looked at Thomas. He looked back at his ledger. No, he said. No formal amendment was filed. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when an important fact becomes undeniable. Then the document in your files, Clara said, her voice precise and very calm, has been altered without authorization. Between the time it was originally filed 12 years ago and the time Caldwell's agent accessed it 4 months ago, someone added language to a legal document held in the custody of this office. Crane had gone somewhat pale. That would be, he started. A crime, Clara said. Yes, it would be. They were back in this wagon by early afternoon, with certified copies of both the access log and the altered document. Crane, who was now very aware of his own potential exposure in this situation, had been cooperative with a speed that suggested he understood exactly what the conversation with his office supervisor was going to look like. Thomas drove and said nothing for a long stretch of road. Clara let him be quiet. She understood by now that his silences were not avoidance. They were processing. He thought before he spoke, and he meant what he said, and those two qualities together meant you sometimes waited. He had someone go into the territory office, Thomas said finally, 4 months ago, before he sent any letter, before any of this started. I was preparing, Clara said. He identified your ranch as a target, and he spent months setting up the legal foundation before he made his first move. Which means he's done this before, Thomas said. Which means he's done this before, Clara confirmed. You don't develop that methodology from one attempt. The Hensleys, the Merritts. How many others, Thomas thought. In the last 3 years, 6 operations in this valley have sold to Caldwell, he said. I only know the details of 2 of them well enough to say anything. But 6 in 3 years is not a coincidence. No, Clara said. It's a pattern. She opened her satchel and looked at the documents inside. Thomas, if we can prove the pattern, if we can show that this same method, the altered deed, the fabricated provision was used against other property owners in this territory, then what we have is not just a defense against his claim on your land. Thomas looked at her. We have enough for federal charges, he said slowly. We have enough for federal charges, Clara said. The wagon moved through the valley road with the winter light falling flat and cold across the frozen grass on either side. Thomas watched the road and thought about Ed Hensley, who had felt like he'd failed his grandfather, and about the Merritts and the 4 other operations he didn't know the details of, and about a man named Richard Caldwell, who had been moving through this valley for 3 years, systematically, methodically dismantling the livelihoods of families who had built something real in this territory. I want to talk to the Hensleys, Thomas said. So do I, Clara said. And the Merritts, and whoever else we can reach. She was writing on her notepad, fast and purposeful. We need testimony. We need their original deed documents if they kept copies. We need to know if the same provision appeared in their altered filings. Ed Hensley's in Nebraska, Thomas said. Can you write to him? I can do better than that, Thomas said. Ed's son James is still in the valley. He stayed behind to settle some remaining business. I know where he's staying. Clara looked up from her notepad. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow morning, Thomas said. She nodded and wrote something down. Thomas watched the road and thought about the fact that he was not doing this alone. That thought was larger than it should have been. He knew that. He had done everything alone for 6 years. Every problem, every decision, every long night of staring at the ceiling, working through something that should have been shared and wasn't. He had managed. Everyone said so. He had managed. But managing alone and having someone beside you were different in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to unfeel once you'd felt it. The second piece of trouble arrived that same evening in the form of a social call that was not a social call. Thomas and Clara had returned to the ranch by late afternoon, and Clara was in the kitchen working through the documents they'd brought back when a wagon pulled into the yard. Not Pete's, not the firewood suppliers, not anyone Thomas recognized from the road. The man who knocked on the door was well-dressed, around 50, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. Thomas opened the door. "Mr. Walker," the man said. "My name is Gerald Foss. I'm a business associate of Richard Caldwell. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." Thomas looked at him. "You've come a long way," Thomas said. "Caldwell's already sent a letter and a lawyer. Now a business associate." Foss smiled the way practiced men smiled, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. "Mr. Caldwell is simply trying to reach a reasonable resolution," Foss said. "He has no desire to make this unpleasant. His interest in Walker Ranch is purely financial. The debt provision is fraudulent," Clara said. Both men turned. Clara was standing in the hallway behind Thomas, still holding her notepad, with the particular expression she wore when she had decided something and was communicating it. Foss looked at her. "And you are," he said. "Clara Bennett," she said. "I manage the records for this ranch. I've spent the last 12 hours reviewing Mr. Walker's original deed documents alongside the altered copy filed with the Territory Office and the access log, showing that Mr. Caldwell's representatives accessed those files 4 months ago without authorization to amend them." She held his gaze. "The provision your employer is claiming does not exist in Mr. Walker's actual deed. The Territory Filing Office is already aware that their records have been tampered with. I expect that conversation will become significantly more official very shortly." The smile on Foss's face did not disappear exactly. It recalibrated. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "I don't think you understand the complexity of territorial property law." "I understand it well enough," Clara said. "I understand that altering a filed legal document without authorization is fraud. I understand that using a fraudulently altered document to assert a false debt claim is also fraud. And I understand that a man who has employed this method against at least 6 property owners in this valley over the past 3 years is not engaged in a business dispute. He's engaged in systematic theft." Foss was very still. Thomas had not moved from the doorway. He was watching Clara with an expression that Pete, had he been present, would have recognized as the same expression Thomas had worn when the flower went across her face, a kind of startled recognition, as if he was seeing something he'd already known was there but hadn't yet seen clearly. "I'll convey your concerns to Mr. Caldwell," Foss said after a pause. "You do that," Clara said. "And you might also convey that Mr. Walker has no intention of selling, settling, or responding to any further communication that doesn't come through a territorial court. If Mr. Caldwell has a legitimate claim, which he does not, he's welcome to bring it before a judge." Foss turned back to Thomas. Thomas said, "You heard her." Foss left. Thomas closed the door. He stood for a moment with his hand still on the door frame and then turned to look at Clara. She was already walking back to the kitchen table. "He's going to report everything I said to Caldwell," she said without stopping. "I know," Thomas said, following her. "Which means Caldwell knows we've been to the Territory Office and we know about the alteration." "Yes." "Which means his next move will be faster and probably less polite than a letter." Thomas sat down across from her. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "You told him we have evidence we don't fully have yet," he said. It wasn't a criticism, his tone was level, thoughtful. "I told him what we will have," she said. "Once we've spoken to James Hensley and whoever else confirms the pattern." She held his gaze. I know I pushed. If you want me to, no, Thomas said, quiet and definite. I want Caldwell to know we're not going to fold. Whatever comes next, I don't want him to think he caught us unprepared. A pause. You're right. That was the right thing to say. Clara looked at him for a moment. Are you sure? I'm sure, Thomas said. Something passed between them across the table, something that had been building for weeks and was getting harder to keep at the level of professional partnership. Clara looked down at her documents. We need to move quickly, she said. James Hensley, the Merritts, any other families you know who sold to Caldwell? I'll ride out to Hensley first thing, Thomas said. You come with me. She looked up. You want me there? You ask better questions than I do, he said simply. Clara held his gaze for one beat, then two. All right, she said. James Hensley was a young man, mid-20s, with his father's careful eyes and the careful posture of someone who had been carrying a heavy thing for long enough that it had changed how he stood. He met them the following morning at the temporary room he was renting above the Willow Creek hardware store, and when Thomas explained why they had come, something happened in his face that Clara recognized the particular expression of a person who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Dad kept a copy, James said. Of everything, the original deed, the original purchase agreement. He said he always kept copies because his father told him that official documents had a way of changing when you weren't watching. Thomas leaned forward. Do you still have those copies? In a box in Nebraska, James said. But I can write to him today. He'll send them. He looked between Thomas and Clara. What did you find? Clara explained. Precisely, completely, without softening the details. James listened with his hands folded on the table and his jaw tight. I knew it, he said when she finished. I told my father. I said the provision they showed us, the debt clause they used to threaten him, didn't sound like something he would have signed. He'd read that deed 20 times. He knew every word of it. James looked at Thomas. But by the time we understood what had happened, the lawyer Caldwell sent was already talking about court dates and legal costs and how much it would cost to fight it. And my father... He stopped. He's 64 years old. He'd already had one bad year on the cattle. He looked at the numbers and decided the fight would cost more than the land. Thomas was quiet. He was wrong, James said. But I understand why he thought it. Clara said, James, if we bring this before a territorial judge, if we can show the pattern, the altered deeds, the same provision appearing across multiple properties, your father may have grounds to challenge the sale, to get the land back. James looked at her. Is that real? He said. Or are you giving me hope because it's kind? I don't give people hope because it's kind, Clara said. It's real if we can prove the pattern. And proving the pattern requires your father's original documents alongside the others. James looked at Thomas. You trust her, he said. Thomas said, completely. James nodded slowly. I'll write to my father today, he said. I'll tell him to send everything. On the ride back from Willow Creek, Thomas said something that had been working its way toward the surface for weeks. When I saw you stand up to Foss last night, he said, I thought... He stopped. Clara looked at him sideways. You thought what? She said. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I thought Margaret would have liked you, he said. The name sat in the cold air between them. Clara did not look away. Tell me about her, she said quietly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. It was the longest she had waited for him to speak. She was practical, he said finally. Like you. She didn't waste words. She saw things clearly, and she said them, and she was usually right. He paused. She died of a fever. Spring of 1880. It was fast. I didn't understand how sick she was until she was already gone. Clara said nothing. She let the words be what they were. After, Thomas said, I just worked. I worked until I couldn't think. I told myself that was managing. That was being practical. A pause. It took me a long time to realize I wasn't managing anything except avoidance. Clara was quiet for a beat. When did you realize that? She said. Thomas turned and looked at her for one moment before looking back at the road. Recently, he said. Clara held that word carefully, the way you held something fragile that you weren't sure yet how to set down. Thomas, she said. He looked at her. Whatever this is between us, she said, I need it to stay honest. I need you to mean what you say and say what you mean. That's the only way I know how to do things. A pause. I'm not Margaret. I'm not going to be what you remember. I'm only going to be what I actually am. Thomas held her gaze for a long moment. I know that, he said. I'm not looking for what I had. Then what are you looking for? She said. He was quiet. I'm not sure I know yet, he said. But I think it starts with not being alone. Clara looked at the road ahead. That, she said quietly, I understand. Caldwell's next move came 4 days later, and it was not a letter. Thomas came in from the north to find Pete waiting for him in the yard with an expression on his face that meant something had gone wrong in a way that hadn't happened yet, but was about to. Water, Pete said. Thomas went still. The north trough, Pete said. Dry. And the line from the creek that feeds it, someone cut it. Clean cut. Not an accident. Thomas said nothing for a moment. When? He said. Sometime last night, Pete said. Gus found it this morning. We've been running water by bucket to keep the cattle from going dry, but we can't do that indefinitely. Thomas turned and walked toward the house. Clara was at the table when he came in. She read his face before he spoke. What happened? She said. Water line to the north trough was cut, Thomas said. Deliberately. Clara set down her pen. Caldwell, she said. It's the same method, Thomas said. What Ed Hensley described. Problems that couldn't be proven. Pressure that built gradually. Create enough difficulty that the cost of fighting looks higher than the cost of selling. Clara was quiet for the moment. He knows we went to the territory office, she said. He knows we know about the deed. He's escalating. Yes, Thomas said. She looked at him. This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Thomas said again. Are you prepared for that? Thomas looked at her steadily. Are you? He said. Clara held his gaze. The question was larger than the water line, larger than the deed, larger than Richard Caldwell. Yes, yes, she said. Thomas nodded once. He put on his coat and went back out to deal with the water line, and Clara turned back to her documents, and neither of them said anything more about the conversation on the road, or the word recently that Thomas had used when she asked him when he'd realized he'd been avoiding his own life. But the word stayed between them quiet and real, like something planted in winter ground that nobody could see yet, but that was already under the frozen surface beginning to grow. Outside, the wind came down from the north ridge, and the cattle moved restlessly in the far field, and the water line that someone had cut in the dark ran dry against the frozen earth. And inside Walker Ranch, Clara Bennett bent over a set of documents that could bring down a man's criminal empire and wrote with careful, certain hands, and did not let herself think too hard about the fact that somewhere in the past 60 days, the ranch she had come to as an employee had become something she would fight for. The way you fought for something that was yours. The documents from Nebraska arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after James Hensley wrote to his father. Clara heard the wagon from the kitchen and was at the front door before Thomas reached the porch. James came in carrying a flat wooden box tied with cord, and he set it on the kitchen table with the careful hands of someone delivering something irreplaceable. Dad sent everything, James said. Every piece of paper he had from the original purchase. The deed, the purchase agreement, the correspondence with the territory office when he first filed. Everything. He looked at Clara. He also wrote a letter. He handed it to her. Clara read it standing at the table. Thomas watched her face. Ed Hensley's handwriting was the careful, deliberate script of a man who had not written many letters and wanted each word to be right. He described the provision Caldwell's lawyer had used against him, the exact language, the specific clause, the debt obligation that had appeared in his filed deed, but not in the copy he held. He described the lawyer's visit. He described the timeline. Clara looked up from the letter. "It's identical," she said. "The provision, the exact language, word for word." James sat down. "Same as yours," he said to Thomas. "Same as mine," Thomas said. Clara set the letter down and opened the wooden box and began going through the documents with the focused speed she used when she already knew what she was looking for and needed to confirm it was there. It was there. Ed Hensley's original deed was clean, no secondary provision, no debt clause, nothing that resembled the language Caldwell had used to force the sale. His filed copy, which he had obtained from the territory office before selling, and kept with the same stubborn thoroughness as everything else, contained the addition. 3 additional sentences. Page 4, 3rd paragraph. Word for word, identical to the alteration in Thomas's filed deed. Clara spread both documents on the table side by side, Walker's and Hensley's, and put her finger on the identical passage in each. "The same person wrote this," she said. "The same hand, the same legal phrasing, the same placement in the document structure." She looked between Thomas and James. "This is not 2 separate incidents. This is a system. Someone prepared template language for this provision and inserted it into multiple filed deeds across this territory." James was staring at the 2 documents. "How many?" he said. "We don't know yet," Clara said. "But we have 2 confirmed cases with documentation. 2 is a pattern. 3 is a case." She looked at Thomas. "The merits," he said immediately. "I need to find them," Clara said. "Today if possible." Thomas was already reaching for his coat. The Merritts had not gone far. Martha Merritt was staying with her sister in Willow Creek in a small house on the east end of town. And when Thomas knocked on the door and explained why they had come, she let them in with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation longer than she had expected to wait. "I told William from the beginning," Martha said. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her voice was steady, in the way of a woman who had processed her anger long enough to know exactly where it lived. "I told him the document they showed us was wrong. We'd read our deed. We knew what was in it." Clara leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Merritt, do you still have your original deed?" Martha looked at her. "William has it," she said. "He took it with him when he went to his brother's in Kansas. He couldn't look at it anymore, but he couldn't throw it away either." A pause. "I kept the copy we got from the territory office when we were trying to fight it, before the lawyer fees made fighting impossible." "May I see it?" Clara said. Martha got up and came back with a folded document and handed it to Clara. Clara unfolded it. She found page 4. She found the 3rd paragraph. She set it beside the Hensley filed copy she had brought with her. Thomas watched her face. The expression she wore was not triumph. It was too serious for that. It was the expression of someone who had confirmed something they needed confirmed and was now fully aware of what it meant. "Mrs. Merritt," Clara said, looking up, "the provision in your filed deed matches the provision in the Hensley deed and in Thomas Walker's deed. Exactly. The same language, the same placement." She held the woman's gaze. "Caldwell used the same method against all 3 of you, and we believe against others in this valley as well." Martha was very still. "Can you prove that in court?" she said. "With your document and your testimony?" Clara said, "Yes, I believe we can." Martha looked at Thomas. "Thomas Walker," she said quietly. "Your wife was a good woman. She would be glad to see you fighting this." Thomas said nothing, but something moved across his face that Clara noted and set aside for later. "Will you testify?" Clara said. Martha unfolded her hands. "Tell me when and where," she said. They had 3 confirmed cases by Thursday evening. Clara worked at the kitchen table until midnight building the documentation into a structure that a territorial judge could follow, organized chronologically cross-referenced by document, with a summary that laid out the pattern in language that was clear and precise and left nothing to interpretation. Thomas sat across from her for part of it, not reviewing documents, but present in the way he'd developed the habit of being present when she was working on something that mattered, as if his being in the room was a form of support he didn't know how to offer differently. At some point past 10, he put coffee in front of her without being asked. She looked up. "Thank you," she said. He sat back down. "How much longer?" he said. 2 hours, she said. "Maybe 3. He didn't suggest she stop. He got up and added wood to the fire and sat back down and picked up the survey report he'd been reading for 2 weeks and had not yet finished, and they worked in the same room through the late hours of a January night with the cold pressing against the windows and the lamp between them burning steadily. Around midnight, Clara set her pen down and looked at the completed summary on the table in front of her. "It's enough," she said. Thomas looked up. "For the judge." "For the judge," she said. 3 confirmed cases with matching documentation. Altered deeds, identical provisions, same filing method. Crane at the Territory Office has confirmed the unauthorized access. We have testimony from Martha Merritt. We'll have Ed Hensley's written affidavit." She looked at him. "It's enough to bring formal charges." Thomas looked at the stack of documents. "Who do we take it to?" he said. "There's a federal circuit judge who handles territorial fraud cases," Clara said. "His name is Hargrove. He's in Harlan County on the 2nd Tuesday of every month." She paused. "That's 9 days from now." "9 days," Thomas said. 9 days, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell will know we're building a case," Thomas said. "Foss will have told him about our conversation. He knows we went to the Territory Office. He knows we've been talking to people." He looked at her. 9 days is enough time for him to move against us." "I know," Clara said. "He's already cut the waterline," Thomas said. "The next thing will be worse." "I know that too," Clara said. She held his gaze without flinching. "Thomas, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly." He waited. "Are you scared?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, simply and without apology. Clara nodded. "So am I," she said. "But scared and stopped are different things." Thomas looked at her across the lamp and the documents and the long hours of the night they had just worked through together, and felt something that he recognized and had been refusing to name for weeks. He named it now privately in the quiet of his own chest. He did not say it out loud, but he named it. Caldwell's next move came on Saturday morning, and it was not a cut water line. It was a visit. Not from a lawyer, not from a business associate. Richard Caldwell himself. Thomas was in the yard when the wagon came through the gate. A good wagon, well-maintained, pulled by matched horses that announced money in the easy way that expensive things did. The man who stepped down from it was around 50 broad through the shoulders, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades being the largest force in every room he entered. He looked at Thomas with an expression of studied pleasantness that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I think it's time we had a direct conversation." "I think you're right," Thomas said. They went inside. Clara was at the table. She did not stand up when Caldwell came in, and she did not arrange her expression into anything welcoming. She simply looked at him the way she looked at things she was assessing directly without performance. Caldwell looked at her and then at Thomas. "Your housekeeper," he said. "My records manager," Thomas said. "She stays." Caldwell sat. He had the manner of a man accustomed to negotiations, which was to say, he was comfortable with silence and used it deliberately. He let the quiet sit for a moment after he settled into the chair, as if he were testing what kind of people he was dealing with. Thomas and Clara waited. "I've heard some concerning things," Caldwell said finally, "about conversations at the Territory Office, about suggestions of impropriety in my business dealings." His tone was careful, not aggressive, not apologetic, landing exactly in the professionally neutral zone of someone who was keeping options open. "I'd like to address those concerns directly if I may." "Address them," Thomas said. Caldwell looked at Thomas. "Walker Ranch has had a difficult few years," he said. "The cattle numbers are down from your peak. The operation is leaner than it was when your wife was managing things alongside you." A deliberate pause. "I have respect for what you've built here, which is why I'm here personally, rather than letting lawyers handle this." Thomas said nothing. "My offer is straightforward," Caldwell said. Fair market value for the ranch. More than fair, actually. Enough for you to start again somewhere else without the burden of a debt obligation that I assure you is entirely legitimate and properly documented. Thomas said, It's not. Caldwell blinked. I beg your pardon. The debt provision, Thomas said, is not in my original deed. We have the documentation to prove it. We have 2 other property owners in this valley whose filed deeds contain the same fabricated provision. We have the access log from the territory office showing your representative altered those documents 4 months ago. He looked at Caldwell without heat, without drama. Just facts. The offer is declined, and I'd suggest you talk to your lawyer before you say anything else. Caldwell's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did a very small recalibration, the kind that happened when a man who was accustomed to holding all the cards realized someone had been looking at his hand. He turned to Clara. Miss Bennett, he said, you're a capable woman, I can see that. But you've involved yourself in something that's considerably more complex than what you can see from a ranch kitchen table. Clara looked at him. I've involved myself in a fraud case, she said. With documentation supporting that characterization, the complexity is on your end, Mr. Caldwell, not mine. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. You came here looking for work, he said to her. His tone shifted, still smooth, but with something underneath it now. You're a woman without property, without family in this territory, without any standing that would protect you if this situation became legally complicated. He paused. I'd think carefully about how much of Thomas Walker's trouble you want to make your own. The threat was so well dressed that it took a moment to recognize it. Clara recognized it immediately. Are you threatening me? She said. Her voice was level and interested, as if she were asking a factual question. Caldwell spread his hands. I'm offering perspective, he said. Thomas stood up. He was not a dramatic man, and what he did was not dramatic. He simply stood and looked at Caldwell with the flat, complete attention of a man who had made a decision. Get off my property, Thomas said. Caldwell looked up at him. Walker. Now, Thomas said. The word was quiet. It had the quality of a door closing. Caldwell stood. He adjusted his coat with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted it understood that he was leaving because he chose to not, because he'd been made to. He looked at Clara one more time. Think about what I said, he told her. Clara looked back at him without expression. I'll think about what you said, she said. And then I'll see you in front of Judge Hargrove. Caldwell left. Thomas stood at the window and watched the wagon move out through the gate and down the road until it disappeared. Clara sat at the table and let out a slow breath. He's frightened, she said. Thomas turned from the window. He came here himself, Clara said. He doesn't send himself when he's confident. He sends lawyers and business associates. He came personally because something we've done has scared him enough to make him think he needed to handle it himself. Thomas looked at her. You figured that out while he was sitting there, he said. While he was threatening me, yes, Clara said. Thomas crossed the room and sat back down across from her. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been carefully not examining for weeks. Clara, he said. She looked at him. He threatened you, Thomas said. His voice was controlled, but underneath the control, there was something that was not controlled at all. He did, she said. Because of me. Because of this ranch. Because you've been fighting for something that isn't... He stopped. Isn't mine, Clara said quietly. Thomas looked at her. I was going to say, he said carefully, because you've been fighting for something that you didn't have to fight for. You came here for a job. This. He made a small gesture that encompassed the documents, the Hensley box, everything on the table. This is beyond any job I offered you. Clara was quiet for a moment. Thomas, she said, can I say something honest? You always say something honest, he said. I've never known you to do otherwise. She held his gaze. I stopped thinking of this as a job a while ago, she said. I'm not sure when exactly. Somewhere between the supply projection and the territory office and the night we sat here until midnight. She paused. I don't know what it is instead, but it's not a job. The lamp made its small sounds. Thomas said, "No, it's not." They looked at each other across the table. Neither of them moved. "The hearing is in 9 days," Clara said finally, her voice softer than usual. 9 days, Thomas said. "We should focus on that," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them looked away for another long moment. Then Clara picked up her pen, and Thomas picked up the survey report he had never finished, and they went back to work side by side in the way they had learned to be together, not talking about the thing that was real between them, but no longer pretending it wasn't there. 6 days before the hearing, Pete came in from the east field with news that made Thomas go cold. "Someone's been through the eastern fence," Pete said. 3 sections cut. Cattle are drifting into Caldwell's boundary land." Thomas was pulling his coat on before Pete finished the sentence. "Get Gus," Thomas said. "We need to round them up before Caldwell's men claim they strayed permanently." He turned to Clara. "Stay inside," he said. "I'll be fine," she said. "Clara." His voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, not controlling, scared. "Please." She stopped. She looked at him. "All right," she said. Thomas went. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of horses leaving the yard, and thought about the word please and the edge beneath it, and what it meant that Thomas Walker, who spoke in facts and used words like tools and never wasted them, had said please, with his voice cracking slightly on the single syllable. She thought about what that meant for a long time. They got the cattle back by mid-afternoon, all but 2, that had drifted deep enough into the boundary land that recovering them without a confrontation wasn't possible. Thomas came back tighter around the jaw than she'd seen him since Caldwell's visit. "Two head," he said, pulling off his coat. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "It's a message," Thomas said. "Not about the cattle, about what he can do, about how easy it is for him to make things difficult." He sat down heavily. "He's trying to exhaust us before the hearing." Clara set coffee in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said. "And I need you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way you might be inclined to interpret it." Clara waited. "When this is over," Thomas said, "when the hearing is done and Caldwell has been dealt with, I don't want you to leave." Clara was very still. "Your contract is 3 months," Thomas said. "You've been here nearly that long. You'll have completed what you agreed to do, and more." He paused. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need a records manager. I'm not asking you to stay because the ranch is better run than it's been in years, which it is." He stopped, started again. "I'm asking you to stay because I've been alone for 6 years, and I had convinced myself that was what I deserved, or what I preferred, or what was simply true about my life now. And in the past 2 months, you have made that feel—" He looked for the right word. "Incorrect." Clara looked at him. "Incorrect," she said softly. "The loneliness I was managing," Thomas said. "It felt like a fact, like weather, like something that just was." He looked at his hands on the table. "You made it feel like a choice, and I don't want to keep making it." The silence between them was so complete that the fire in the stove sounded loud. Clara thought about a December night and a stranger's door, and a woman with a suitcase making a calculated decision in the dark. She thought about supply projections and territory offices and falsified deeds, and a man who fixed a shelf bracket because she'd implied he might not do it that day. She thought about the word recently on the cold road to Harlan County. "I need to say something honest back," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm scared," she said. "Not of Caldwell, of this, of—" She paused, choosing precisely. "Of wanting something and being wrong about whether it's real. I've been wrong before about people who I thought chose me. They needed something from me, and when the need was resolved, so was I." Thomas looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need something from you," he said. "I'm asking you to stay because the house is quieter when you're not in it, and that has nothing to do with the cooking or the records or anything practical." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because you remind me that life is more than managing, and I don't want to forget that again." Clara's eyes were bright. She did not cry. She was Clara Bennett, and she did not cry in front of people. But her eyes were very bright. "Ask me again," she said quietly. "After the hearing. When everything is settled and you've had time to be sure." Thomas looked at her. "I'm already sure," he said. "I know," she said. "But ask me again anyway." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. She nodded once, the small decisive nod she used when something had been resolved. She picked up her pen. "We have 6 days," she said. "We need the summary refined, and the documents organized in the order Hargrove will want to see them." Thomas sat up straight. "Tell me what to do," he said. And for the first time in 6 years, Thomas Walker said those words to another person and meant them completely, not as a concession, not as defeat, but as something that felt astonishingly like relief. The night before the hearing, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the East Wing room and stared at the ceiling and went through the documents in her mind. The order, the evidence, the testimony. Every gap that Caldwell's lawyer could try to exploit, and how she had closed each one. She heard footsteps in the hallway around midnight. A pause outside her door. Then Thomas's voice low. "Clara, you awake?" "Yes," she said. A beat of quiet. "So am I," he said. She almost laughed. "Is there coffee?" she said. A pause. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. She pulled on her robe and went to the kitchen, and Thomas was already at the stove with his back to her, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was low, and it was the middle of the night, before the most important day either of them had faced in years. They sat across from each other with their coffee. "Are you ready?" Thomas said. Clara looked at her cup. "I've done everything I know how to do," she said. "The evidence is real. The documentation is solid. The pattern is clear." She looked up. "Hargrove is a fair judge. I've asked about him. He doesn't let courtroom intimidation substitute for evidence, which means Caldwell's money and his lawyers matter less than they would in front of someone else." Thomas nodded. "And if it doesn't go the way we want," he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Then we find the next thing," she said. "We don't stop. We build a different approach, and we come back." She met his eyes. "That's what you do when you're not ready to give up." Thomas looked at her. "I thought about a woman who had walked across a valley in a December storm because giving up was not in her vocabulary." He thought about the past 2 months. He thought about what it felt like to wake up in the morning knowing that someone was in the kitchen and the coffee would be strong and the day would be met by 2 people instead of 1. He thought, "I have not felt this in 6 years." He thought, "I don't want to lose it. Whatever happens tomorrow," he said. "I want you to know something." Clara looked at him. "You came here needing a job," he said. "And I." He stopped and chose the words carefully, the way he always did when they mattered. "I thought I was doing you a favor by giving you one. I understand now that it was the other way around." Clara set down her cup. She looked at him across the lamp in the middle of the night, this quiet, careful, broken and rebuilt man who fixed shelf brackets the same day he said he would, and looked at distances, and had spent 6 years managing instead of living. "Thomas," she said. He waited. "We gave each other something," she said. "That's not a favor. That's—" She looked for the right word. "That's what happens when 2 people are paying attention." Thomas held her gaze. Outside, the January dark sat over the valley, and the cattle moved quietly in the far field. And somewhere on the road to Harlan County, Richard Caldwell was no doubt preparing his own arguments for the following day. Inside, a lamp burned between them. And 2 people who had each decided months ago that they were done expecting happiness sat in the same kitchen in the middle of the same night and felt quietly and without fanfare the specific warmth of being completely wrong about that. The morning of the hearing. Thomas was up before Clara. She found him at the kitchen table at 5:15, with his coffee already cold in front of him, which told her he had been sitting there for a while. He was not reviewing documents. He was not doing anything practical. He was simply sitting with the stillness of a man who had run out of preparations and was now in the part of a serious situation where you waited to find out whether the work was enough. Clara poured herself coffee and sat down across from him. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Some," he said. She looked at him. "Thomas." He met her eyes. "The documents are solid," she said. "The evidence is real. We have 3 confirmed cases with matching documentation and access log from the Territory Office. Crane's statement, Martha Merritt's testimony, and Ed Hensley's written affidavit." She said it evenly, not to reassure him, but because it was true, and she believed in stating what was true. "Caldwell can bring every lawyer in Harlan County into that room. It won't change what the documents say." Thomas looked at her. "I know," he said. "Then what is it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been depending on people my whole life," he said slowly. "My father, Margaret, Pete, and Gus. The men who built this operation alongside me." He paused. "When Margaret died, I decided I was done depending on people. That it was safer to do everything myself, even when doing it myself meant doing it wrong." He looked at his cold coffee. "These past 2 months I've been depending on you. Every step of this. And I'm not afraid of losing the land anymore." He looked up. "I'm afraid of losing you." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara set down her cup. "You're not going to lose me," she said. It came out simple and certain, the way she said things she had already decided. "Whatever happens today, that's not on the table." Thomas held her gaze. "You told me to ask again after the hearing," he said. "I did," she said. "I'm going to ask again after the hearing," he said. "I know," she said. Something settled between them. Not resolved exactly, but placed carefully aside, the way you set something valuable down when you needed both hands free. "We should go," Thomas said. "We should go," Clara agreed. She picked up the document satchel. He picked up his coat, and they walked out of Walker Ranch together in the January dark toward whatever the day was going to bring. The territorial courtroom in Harlan County was a plain room with plain wooden benches and a high window that let in the flat winter light without warmth. By the time Thomas and Clara arrived, it was already half full. Martha Merritt was there sitting with her hands folded and her chin level, wearing her best dress and the expression of a woman who had been waiting to say something true in an official setting for a long time. James Hensley was there with his father's affidavit in a sealed envelope. Aldous Crane from the Territory Office was there, looking considerably less comfortable than anyone else in the room, with a folder of access records under his arm, and Richard Caldwell was there. He sat on the opposite side of the room with 2 lawyers flanking him, and the practiced ease of a man who had been in courtrooms before and had until recently always left them satisfied. He glanced at Thomas when they came in. He glanced at Clara. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened by a fraction that Clara, who had spent 2 months learning to read the small indicators of what people were actually feeling, did not miss. He was not as confident as he looked. Good. Judge Hargrove entered at precisely 9 o'clock, and the room settled. How was a compact man in his 60s, with the economy of movement and attention that came from decades of hearing people argue about things that mattered and things that didn't, and learning to tell the difference quickly. He looked at the room over his spectacles and said, "We're here to hear an application regarding contested deed provisions on Walker Ranch property with related allegations of document fraud in the territorial filing system. I've read the initial filings from both parties. We'll begin with the property owner's presentation." Clara stood. Caldwell's lead lawyer, a man named Sherwood, was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor," Sherwood said smoothly, "the property owner is represented today by—" "Miss Clara Bennett," Clara said, addressing the judge directly. "I am not Mr. Walker's legal representative. I am the records manager for Walker Ranch, and I have prepared and organized the documentary evidence we are presenting today. Mr. Walker will speak for himself. I am here to present the documents." Hargrove looked at her over his spectacles. "Are you an attorney, Miss Bennett?" "No, Your Honor," Clara said. "But the documents speak for themselves and do not require an attorney to be legible." Something moved at the corner of Hargrove's mouth. "Proceed," he said. Clara presented the evidence, the way she had organized everything in her life, with precision, clarity, and the complete absence of anything that wasn't necessary. She placed the 3 original deeds on the record, Walker Hensley Merritt. She placed the 3 altered filed copies alongside them. She walked Hargrove through page 4, paragraph 3 of each document, pointing to the identical provision in all 3 filed versions, and its complete absence in all 3 originals. She presented Crane's access log. She presented Crane's statement confirming that no formal amendment had been filed at the time of the access. She presented Ed Hensley's affidavit, which described in his own careful handwriting the exact language Caldwell's lawyer had used against his family, matching word for word the provision Clara had documented. She presented Martha Merritt, who stood and gave her testimony in the level, factual tone of a woman who had decided she was done being afraid and said exactly what had happened to her family and exactly what had been used to make it happen. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Hargrove looked at the documents on his desk for a long moment. Then he looked at Sherwood. "Counselor," he said, "your response." Sherwood's response was well-constructed, professionally delivered, and built on a foundation that Clara had spent 9 days deliberately undermining. He argued that the filed deed was the legal document of record. He argued that provisions in a filed deed superseded any personal copy held by the property owner. He argued that without direct evidence connecting Caldwell personally to any alteration, the question of who had changed the documents was unresolved. Howe was correct on every point except one. He had not accounted for the pattern. Clara had known from the beginning that any single case could be argued as clerical error, misunderstanding, misfiled paperwork. What could not be argued as accident was 3 cases with identical language, identical placement, identical method, and a single common denominator in the form of Richard Caldwell's name on every resulting purchase agreement. When Sherwood finished, Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Bennett, the 3 provisions you've documented, you're representing them as identical in language. I'd like to verify that characterization." Clara stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He read. He compared. He set the documents down. He looked at Sherwood. "Counselor," he said, "the provision appearing in these 3 filed deeds uses identical language to within a single word. The probability of 3 separate clerical errors producing identical results in the same location across 3 documents is not a probability I'm prepared to accept." He looked at Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, you have one opportunity to address this directly." Caldwell leaned over and spoke quietly to Sherwood. Sherwood stood. "My client denies any involvement in the alteration of these documents," Sherwood said. "He maintains that the debt provision in Mr. Walker's filed deed is legitimate, and the debt provision in Mr. Walker's filed deed," Hargrove said, "does not appear in Mr. Walker's original signed document. Mr. Crane of this territory's filing office has confirmed unauthorized access to that document by your client's representative. The same pattern exists in 2 other cases with identical results." He set his pen down. "Counselor, I am not going to entertain a defense built on the legitimacy of documents that bear every hallmark of fraudulent alteration." The room was silent. Thomas, sitting beside Clara, felt something shift in the air of the courtroom. The specific shift that happened when a situation that had been uncertain stopped being uncertain. Caldwell knew it too. Clara saw it in the set of his shoulders. The careful man. The practiced man. The man who had done this 6 times and walked away 6 times. He was doing the arithmetic that she had done 9 days ago, and he was arriving at the same answer. The numbers didn't work anymore. Hargrove spoke for 12 minutes. He ruled that the debt provision in Thomas Walker's filed deed was fraudulent, that the notice issued by Caldwell Land and Property Holdings was based on that fraudulent provision and therefore void, and that Walker Ranch property was in no way subject to any claim by Caldwell or his representatives. He also ruled that based on the evidence presented across 3 cases, he was referring the matter to the federal territorial prosecutor for investigation of systematic deed fraud with Caldwell Land and Property Holdings as the named subject. He also said, and this was the part that made Martha Merritt close her eyes briefly and breathe, that the Hensley and Merritt sales, if they had been completed under duress, created by the same fraudulent method, were subject to legal challenge through the proper channels, and that his ruling today provided the documentary foundation for such a challenge. He banged his gavel. And it was over. Not entirely over. Clara knew that. Federal investigations took months. Legal challenges to completed sales took longer. There would be more documents, more hearings, more lawyers, more long nights at the kitchen table going through evidence. But the immediate threat was finished. Walker Ranch was safe. Thomas stood in the corridor outside the courtroom, and Martha Merritt came to him and took his hand in both of hers and said, "Your wife would have been proud of you today." And Thomas said quietly, "She would have been proud of Clara." And Martha looked at Clara with an expression that contained a whole conversation in a single glance. James Hensley shook Thomas's hand and then turned to Clara and said, "My father is going to want to write to you. I hope you'll write back." "Tell him I will," Clara said. Crane from the Territory office approached with the careful bearing of a man who understood that his office's role in this situation was not something he wanted elaborated publicly. He said to Clara quietly, "The filing procedures have already been reviewed. There will be additional safeguards going forward." "Good," Clara said. He left quickly, left. And then they were outside in the January cold. Just Thomas and Clara, the wagon in the yard, and the long road back to Willow Creek ahead of them, and the particular silence of people who have been holding something tightly for a long time and have just been told they can let go. Thomas stood for a moment without moving. Clara stood beside him. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he said. She looked at him. He looked like himself, the same lean, weathered, plain-spoken man who had opened a door in a December storm and said, "Come inside before you freeze," and also not entirely like himself, because something in his face had shifted the way a room shifted when you opened a window that had been closed for too long. He reached over and took the document satchel from her hands. She let him take it. They walked to the wagon. They were 2 miles from Walker Ranch when Thomas said, "I'm asking." Clara looked at him. Now, she said. "You said ask again after the hearing," he said. "The hearing is over." She looked at the road. "Thomas, you said whatever happens today losing you wasn't on the table," he said. "I want to know what that means. I want to know what we are. Not what we might be eventually, not what we'll discuss when things settle. I want to know now." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've spent 6 years being careful about not wanting things. I don't want to be careful about this." Clara was quiet. "What are you asking exactly?" she said. Her voice was very even. She was being careful with it. Thomas pulled the horse to a stop on the empty road. He turned and looked at her directly in the way he looked at things that required full attention. "Stay," he said. "Not as a records manager. Not as someone working a 3-month contract. Stay because this is where you belong. Because that house is your house now just as much as it's mine. Because I don't want to sit at that table in the morning without you across from it." He paused. "Because I love you. And I'm aware that may be too direct, but I don't know another way to say things, and I'm not going to start now." Clara looked at him. She thought about every person who had ever told her she had value when she was useful and disappeared when she wasn't. She thought about every door that had been opened with conditions and closed when she didn't meet them. She thought about Missouri and the farm and the long road to a territory she didn't know and a boarding house bed where she'd counted $4.60 and done the arithmetic 4 times, hoping the numbers would change. She thought about a man who fixed a shelf bracket the same day he said he would. A man who said please with his voice cracking and meant it. A man who sat in his own kitchen after 6 years of silence and made coffee at midnight because she couldn't sleep. She thought this is what chosen feels like. Not needed, not useful, chosen. "I already decided," she said quietly. Thomas looked at her. "When?" he said. She almost smiled. "Ask Crane about the night I wrote the case summary," she said. "I stopped halfway through and I realized I wasn't writing it to save the ranch." She met his eyes. "I was writing it because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." Thomas was very still. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. He waited. "Yes." she said again, clearly looking at him without any of the careful layering she usually put between herself and the things that mattered most. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I love you too. Yes, this is where I belong. A pause. And if you pull this wagon over every time you have something important to say, we're going to be on this road a very long time. Thomas looked at her. He laughed. It was a real laugh. Brief, genuine, the kind that surprised the person producing it, and Clara had never heard it before, and would later think it was the most important thing she heard that entire day, including the judge's ruling. He picked up the reins. The horse started moving. They rode the last 2 miles home in the easy quiet of people who had stopped managing the space between them. The twist nobody saw coming arrived 4 days later, and it came from a direction none of them had been watching. A letter from the Federal Territorial Prosecutor's Office in Denver. Thomas brought it in from the post and handed it to Clara without opening it, because they had developed the habit of handling official correspondence together, and he saw no reason to change that. She opened it. She read it. She read it again. Thomas, she said. He looked at her face and sat down. What is it? She set the letter on the table. The federal investigation into Caldwell, she said carefully. They've been doing preliminary research since Hargrove referred the case, cross-referencing territory records looking for additional cases. She stopped. How many? Thomas said. 11, Clara said. 11 properties across 3 territories, all using the same method, same provision, same placement. She looked at him. Caldwell's been operating this system for at least 8 years. Before this valley. Before the Hensleys. 8 years. Thomas was quiet. And the families, he said. Some are still reachable, Clara said. Some moved on. Some... She looked at the letter. The prosecutor is asking if I would be willing to assist in organizing the documentary evidence across all 11 cases, as a consulting records analyst. The room was very still. Thomas looked at her. They're asking you, he said. They've seen the summary I prepared for Hargrove, Clara said. Apparently, the organization of the evidence was... She glanced at the letter. The prosecutor called it the most clearly structured fraud documentation he had seen from a non-legal source in his 20-year career. Thomas looked at the table. He looked at her. Clara, he said. It would mean some travel, she said quickly. Harlan County probably. Possibly Denver. Coordinating with the other families. It would take months. I know, Thomas said. It's a significant commitment, she said. I know, Thomas said again. She looked at him carefully. You're not going to tell me not to do it, she said. He met her eyes. Why would I tell you not to do it, he said. You spent 9 days building a case that saved this ranch and contributed to a federal investigation into an 8-year fraud operation. You'd be helping 11 families who lost what we almost lost. He paused. Clara, that's who you are. I'm not going to ask you to be smaller than that. She looked at him for a long moment, and there it was, the thing she had not known before this man to look for. Not someone who needed her. Not someone who wanted what she could do for them. Someone who saw what she was capable of and said, go be that, fully, without apology. I'll need help organizing the initial document requests, she said, her voice not entirely steady. The letters to the families, the coordination with the prosecutor's office. Tell me what to do, Thomas said. The same words he had said the night before the hearing. The same words that had meant something different than they used to. Clara picked up her pen. The investigation took 8 months, 3 weeks in Harlan County, 2 trips to Denver, hundreds of letters, document reviews that stretched through nights while Pete and Gus kept the ranch running, and Thomas drove Clara to the stage every time she left and was waiting at the road when she returned. He was always there, every time, without exception. She noticed that and said nothing about it until the 5th trip, when she stepped off the stage in Willow Creek after 2 weeks in Denver and found him waiting in the usual place and said, "You don't have to come every time." Thomas looked at her. "I know," he said. He picked up her bag. "I want to." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. She fell into step beside him, and they walked to the wagon, and she was home. Richard Caldwell was indicted by the Federal Territorial Court in September of 1887 on 14 counts of deed fraud spanning 3 territories. The indictment included testimony from 9 of the 11 affected families, documentary evidence organized and cross-referenced by Clara Bennett, across 4 months of meticulous preparation, and the direct testimony of Aldous Crane, who had negotiated a cooperation agreement with the prosecutor that involved a formal reprimand for his office and significant improvements to filing security protocols. Caldwell's lawyers attempted to negotiate a reduced settlement. The prosecutor declined. The trial lasted 11 days. The verdict was guilty on 12 of the 14 counts. Richard Caldwell was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to liquidate his property holdings to fund a restitution process for the families he had defrauded. The Hensley land went back to James, who wrote Thomas and Clara a letter that contained the single sentence my father cried when I told him, and I am not ashamed to say I did too. Martha Merritt's case was more complicated. The land had already been resold, but the restitution fund covered fair compensation, and she wrote Clara that she intended to buy a house in Willow Creek and stay put. Pete read about the verdict in the Willow Creek Gazette and showed it to Gus in the barn without comment. Gus said, "She did that." Pete said, "They did that." Gus thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." Thomas asked Clara to marry him on the first morning of October, standing in the kitchen where they had spent the better part of a year having early mornings together. And he did it the way he did everything that mattered, directly, without theater, with the full weight of meaning behind every word. "I asked you to stay last January," he said. "You said yes. I want to ask you something else now." Clara looked at him over her coffee cup. She knew what was coming. She had known for weeks. She had been watching him work up to it with the patient attention she gave to things she was certain about. "Ask," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Marry me," he said. "Not because the ranch needs managing. Not because you've become essential to how this place runs, which you have. Because you are the person I want to sit across from at this table for the rest of my life. Because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and honesty is what I value most in the world. Because you came here in a December storm with a suitcase and $4.60. Clara blinked. "How did you know about the $4.60? She said. Thomas almost smiled. "You told Mrs. Holt," he said. Mrs. Holt told her husband. Her husband mentioned it to Pete. Pete told you," Clara said. "Pete told me," Thomas confirmed. 2 months ago. He thought I should know what it cost you to knock on that door." He held her gaze. "I thought about it for 2 months. About what kind of person walks into the unknown in the dark with $4.60 and no guarantees and knocks anyway." He paused. "I want that person to be my wife, if she'll have me." Clara set down her coffee cup. She thought about the arithmetic she had done in a boarding house room in September. $4.60, 11 days until rent, no options, except one that everyone else would have called impossible. She thought about a man opening a door in the rain and stepping back without conditions. She thought about a year of mornings at this table, and documents and hearings and cold roads and midnight coffee, and the slow, deliberate, unspectacular process of 2 broken people becoming whole. "Yes," she said. Not the careful yes of a woman managing her expectations. The full yes of a woman who had stopped expecting very little and found out what happened when you didn't. Thomas crossed the kitchen, and she stood up, and he took her hands in his work-worn, steady hands that had fixed fence lines and rebuilt water pipes, and waited for her at the Willow Creek stage 8 times in 8 months without being asked, and held them. They stood in the kitchen, where everything between them had begun, and everything between them was now completely different, and also, in the ways that mattered most, exactly the same. Years later, people in Willow Creek told the story differently, depending on who was telling it. Some said Clara Bennett was a woman who saved a ranch. Some said Thomas Walker was a man who finally came back to life. Some said it was the federal investigation that mattered, the 11 families, the indictment, the land returned. All of them were right. None of them were entirely right, because the truth of what happened on Walker Ranch in the winter of 1886 And the year that followed was not a story about property or fraud or justice, though it was all of those things. It was a story about two people who had each decided separately and for different reasons that they were done expecting good things, and who discovered in the specific ordinary details of shared mornings and practical conversations and honest words spoken in lamplight that they had been wrong. Thomas Walker had buried himself in work and told himself that managing was enough. He had been wrong. Clara Bennett had buried herself in capability and told herself that being useful was protection enough against being abandoned. She had been wrong. They had both been profoundly, fortunately, irreversibly wrong. The ranch survived because Clara understood documents and patterns and the particular way that fraud hid itself in official language. But Thomas survived because Clara sat across a table from him night after night and reminded him, without ever saying it directly, that a life spent only surviving was a life still waiting to be lived. She had come looking for a job. He had been waiting without knowing it for something that had no job description. Neither of them had planned it. Neither of them had been looking for it. It had arrived the way the most important things arrived, not with announcement, not with ceremony, but in the particular unrepeatable moment of one person saying, "I need a job, not pity," and another person recognizing in those words something he had been trying to say to himself for 6 years. On the first morning of their life as a married couple, Thomas Walker woke early as he always had and came downstairs. Clara was already in the kitchen as she always was. Coffee was on. The lamp was lit. The supply records for the winter quarter were open on the table beside her notepad. She looked up when he came in. He sat down across from her. She pushed the coffee toward him. He picked it up. Outside Walker Ranch was quiet in the early morning. The cattle in the far field, the frost on the fence lines, the long valley running south toward Harlan County, and north toward the Cedar Ridge, and in every direction, as far as you could see, land that was theirs, and safe and real. Inside, two people, who had each believed they were done finding things worth holding, sat across from each other in the ordinary warmth of a shared morning. And that was everything. That was in the end exactly